Excellent. Thank you.
Let's. Okay, so good afternoon. Thanks everybody for coming. Today we welcome back to Georgetown Eric Jacobstein. Currently, he serves as a Deputy Assistant Secretary in the U.S. Department Bureau of Western Hemisphere, Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, covering Central America, Cuba, and regional migration. He previously served at the White House as the Special Advisor to the Vice President for the Western Hemisphere and as a National Security Council Director for Central America and Cuba. In 2021, Eric joined the Biden-Harris administration as a Senior Advisor in the U.S. Agency for International Development's Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean, and as a Staff Director of the Northern Triangle Task Force. Before that, he had a very long career in Congress, including a Senior Policy Advisor on the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, managing the Western Hemisphere portfolio for Chairman Eliot Engel and other committee Democrats. In this role, he was a lead Democratic advisor handling issues related to Latin America and the Caribbean in the House of Representatives. He also served as the staff director of the Senate Caucus on International Narcotics Control while working for Senator Dianne Feinstein. In addition, he has worked for the House Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere, Representative Jim Colby, and at the Inter-American Dialogue. Eric holds an MA in Latin American Studies from the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and a BA in Political Science from Harvard College. Today, Eric is going to talk to us about the administration policy towards Central America. As you know, it has been an extremely difficult time. First, obviously, going through COVID, then the issues of natural disaster, water, food insecurity, and exacerbated climate change issues, on top of the chronic structural challenges that the region faces. So what we're going to do is I will turn the floor to Eric. Eric will speak for, let's say, half an hour, and then we'll open up a session of questions and answers. Thanks. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Alejandro. Thank you, Denise. Thank you to the Institute for having me. It's a real honor to be back here at Georgetown. Particularly pleased to see distinguished ambassadors John Feely, Jimmy Story, Arturo Valenzuela, the former Assistant Secretary of State, and most importantly, all of you, the students here. It's really just, more than anything, I enjoy these experiences to really talk to the next generation of policymakers and diplomats and individuals who care so deeply about the Americas. So what I'd like to do is focus on the two strategies that underpin our work in Central America, our root causes strategy and our collaborative migration management strategy, before getting into some of the very specific challenges in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua. And more than anything, really would like to have time to have a conversation, answer your questions, but really hear your thoughts on these important issues. So, just to backtrack a little bit now that we're, almost 3 years in the administration, in July 2021, the Biden administration rolled out the U.S. strategy to address the root causes of irregular migration from Central America, which is known as the root causes strategy. So under the vice president's leadership, the Biden administration launched this $4 billion 4-year strategy in 2021 with the goal of generating sustainable living conditions for all people throughout the region. And the idea of the strategy is really to promote hope and opportunity for the people of Central America, with the firm belief that a secure and prosperous future lies in individuals' home countries. In our view, the root cause strategy is not only good policy, but it's a tool in our national security interests to manage irregular migration, to ensure that as we do enforcement at the border, as we make clear that the U.S. border is not open, it's also critical to invest in the long-term safety, security, prosperity of the region. The root causes strategy focuses on creating jobs, promoting democratic governance, protecting and promoting respect for human rights, and improving security, so that ultimately Central Americans can build better futures at home without the need to migrate elsewhere. And let me say at the top that the issues that we are confronting in Central America are long-term challenges. These are decades in the making. And we're not naive. We're clear-eyed that, needed change will not happen overnight, and that our efforts require sustained attention and collaboration. Unlike enforcement at the border, investing in root causes is something where you don't see the results overnight. So it's often frustrating. It's often tough to measure results. But, I think there's been sustained progress over time. And making progress, and I'll talk about this a little bit in the context of each of the countries, but it requires a commitment to good governance from U.S. partners in the region. So each pillar of the root causes strategy requires strong governance to make sustainable, equitable progress. And what I mean by this is, we talk about pillars being security, economic growth. Well, you really can't improve security. You can't have sustainable economic growth if you don't have good governance. And I'll talk about Guatemala in a little bit, but to me, that's a key case study and why so much is at stake in the democratic transition. Because we certainly care about economic growth. We certainly care about reducing inequality. But if you don't have the cores of good governance in place, you really can't get there. So, one thing I would note is that learning from past strategies in Central America, from past administrations, Democratic and Republican, one thing that we thought was critical to include is recognition that one of the major drivers of irregular migration is gender-based violence. And so we incorporated this as a key standalone pillar of the root cause strategy, which is something that you don't see in past strategies. Given the high prevalence of violence against women, against children, we're working closely with governments in the region, even when there's differences, to find paths forward to address this issue. So as one example, we, the State Department, are working with the Honduran government right now to form our first Women and Children Protection Partnership. And the partnership would serve as a policy and programmatic framework to engage with the Honduran government on gender-based violence. And our goal is to seek similar arrangements with El Salvador and with Guatemala. And so, promoting respect for human rights, for labor rights, for press freedom are also its own distinct pillar in the strategy. And respect for the rule of law, for vibrant civil society, for free independent press are similarly, they're crucial to providing stable futures for the people of Central America. And unfortunately, much remains to be done in these areas in the region. So one thing I just noted, that June 2022 Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles, we launched, Samantha Power, the USAID administrator, launched the Voices Initiative. And the idea is to bring together like-minded partners throughout Central America, not just in Northern Central America, to protect, defend, and promote civic space in the region. Now, a lot of what we think about in the root cause strategy, and I mentioned the $4 billion commitment over 4 years, is foreign assistance. But foreign assistance alone is not enough. And so we also continue to take robust action to promote accountability for undemocratic actions, for human rights abuses, for corruption. So since launching the root cause strategy, we've used various visa restrictions and sanctions tools for this purpose. When I was in Congress, I worked on legislation to create an authority known as the 353 Authority. Some people call it the Engel List. And the idea behind this authority is to put certain individuals who are undemocratic, who carry out acts of corruption, who facilitate corruption, on a list and to revoke their visas. And the authority is originally created for El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and Congress subsequently added Nicaragua, which was important. And the idea is to, I think some have challenged sanctions and sort of, what do they mean? How do they change behavior? And I think my feeling on this is, and welcome a conversation on sanctions more broadly, but certainly on these individual sanctions, I think it's hard enough to get a visa to the United States. So individuals who commit these acts of corruption should not have the privileges of, obtaining a visa to the United States, should not have the privileges in some cases of being able to store their assets in the United States. So we think these are critical tools, and we work to be agile and strategic when we use them. And I think, when we judge the use of these tools, it's not always visible how these tools stop corruption. But I think there's a certain knowable factor and there's a certain unknowable factor. You don't necessarily know the extent to which individuals are scared into not being corrupt or not committing undemocratic actions because of actions taken against others. So we think these tools are critical, and we've used them. I'll talk about in the Guatemala context, but we'll continue to use them throughout the region. So, next, just want to mention on the economic front, this has been an area that Vice President Harris has, really been a true leader on, launching something called Central America Forward, which is an innovative public-private sector partnership in Central America. And the idea is to drive investment in Central America and to really create good jobs in the region, not just jobs. And under Central America Forward, companies have committed to invest over $4.2 billion in El Salvador, in Guatemala, and in Honduras. And over $1 billion of these commitments have already been deployed on the ground in investments and loans and procurements. These investments have created thousands of jobs. They've also connected 4 million people to the internet, brought more than 1 million people into the formal financial economy, and trained almost 500,000 people to enhance workforce abilities, including digital and language skills. So, this isn't just about investment, and the partnership on Central America, the 501c3, the NGO that we partner with on these issues, has really done important work on the rule of law and good governance and on human rights. Just in September in San Jose in Costa Rica, the Seattle International Foundation put on a donors forum, and at that forum, the Partnership for Central America worked with Transparency International to launch an anti-corruption and transparency initiative for Central America, which will be fully funded by the private sector, and it encourages companies to volunteer to be held accountable for operating responsibly, and the partnership has really gotten some good traction on this. So, I would say just generally on the root causes strategy, before talking a little bit about migration, I would say I think there's been significant progress, but again, we're not naive about or Pollyannish about the challenges ahead of us, and emboldened anti-democratic actors continue to push the limits, and there's a lot of work to be done. Before getting to the countries, just want to note that complementing the root cause strategy, in 2021, the administration released the Collaborative Migration Management Strategy. And the idea behind that is a recognition that migration is a regional challenge, and one that requires regional solutions. And so as a result of what we call the CMMS, the Migration Management Strategy, the president and leaders from throughout the region, including a number of leaders from Central America, endorsed the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration Protection on the margins of the Summit of the Americas in June 2022. And the idea is to underscore our shared responsibility and provide a mechanism to collaborate on cross-border challenges. A couple of things I'd say on migration. One is, we continue to have robust enforcement of the border. It's clear that the border is not open. But complementing that, this administration has rolled out more legal pathways than any administration in recent history. So just to name a couple, the Safe Mobility Offices, which now operate in Guatemala, in Colombia, in Costa Rica, are now in process to get up and running in Ecuador. Essentially what they do is they provide an additional legal pathway for expedited refugee processing for individuals, so that individuals don't take the dangerous journey north, so that there's an acknowledgement that there's ways to find legal pathways to the United States without traversing the Darien, without going through Central America and up to the U.S.-Mexico border. There's also the CHNV program, which started in January of 2023 for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans who are able to apply for parole in the United States through a sponsor in the U.S. From their home country, rather than coming to the U.S. border. So the idea here is that there are legal pathways available. That's been a real focus for Secretary Blinken, for Secretary Mayorkas, for this administration, as we continue to robustly enforce the border. So let me just, I really want to talk about Guatemala, which is the country that I spend a lot of time on these days. We're extremely worried about continued attempts to undermine democracy and the will of the Guatemalan people. And frankly, each attempt seems even more absurd than the one before it. And sometimes you read things that are coming out and that are about to happen, and it seems unbelievable. But in fact, it is believable. And the fact that, some of these things are laughable don't make them any less threatening. So, our assessment is that anti-democratic actors are getting more desperate the closer we are to President-elect Arevaloh's January 14th inauguration. Many of them have benefited from the status quo in Guatemala, and they don't want to change it. So, we know this is a pivotal moment for Guatemala's democracy, and we're taking it very seriously. So how are we doing that? I would say the first is through high-level visits. So our Deputy Secretary of State, Rich Verma, traveled to Guatemala shortly after the second round of the inauguration in August. Our Assistant Secretary, Brian Nichols, traveled down recently. Just this week, the Vice President's National Security Advisor was in Guatemala. We'll continue to have high-level visits to show our support for the Arevalo administration, show our support for the democratic transition. This is really important to continue doing and to develop a robust agenda. President-elect Arevalo, even as he enters office, will enter office in a very difficult climate where it will be very difficult to accomplish an agenda. So we want to show early on, and we will do so throughout the process, how we will partner with him on all the items, the root cause strategy that I mentioned. I think it's also important to mention that the role of the U.S. Congress is critical here. In Guatemala, often you'll see that partisanship is used by different sectors to say, this only matters to Democrats, this only matters to Republicans. One of our focuses has been to show real bipartisanship. So when President-elect Arevalo has visited Washington and he's met with key individuals in the administration, we met with Secretary Blinken, with the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, with others, which doesn't always happen with presidents-elect. But also we thought it was critical that he meet with members of Congress from both sides of the aisle, which he's done. And we've seen bipartisan statements from members of Congress pushing back on these anti-democratic actions. We've also spent a lot of time engaging the Guatemalan private sector. And, when I started doing interviews on Guatemala in late August, around the time of the transition, a couple of reporters said to me, I said, the Guatemalan private sector has really played a productive role. And they said, really, the Guatemalan private sector? Because it's not something that they had seen in the past. We think the Guatemalan private sector is critical in all this. And it's not a monolith. There are certainly members of the private sector who have played a negative role. But in general, I think there's a recognition by the Guatemalan private sector that they don't want their country to become another Nicaragua, that they want to retain their credit rating, that they want future investment, that they care about the goals of Central America Forward, the goals that we all care about. I think one of the key issues for us has been bringing the private sector together with members of the president-elect's team. They're already meeting, of course, finding ways to forge alliances there. Indigenous groups have also played a critical role in Guatemala recently, especially in pushing back at undemocratic actions by the Attorney General, by the courts, by others who are really trying to undermine democracy. So there's a number of sectors that I think will be really important moving forward as we look at the situation in Guatemala. Would also mention the role of the international community. I come from the U.S. government, but multilaterally, the Organization of American States has just played a fundamental role. Secretary General Almagro has been invested in Guatemala from day one, spent a ton of time on the ground. There was a resolution from the OAS recently condemning the actions, of the undemocratic actions of the Attorney General, of others. And that's just so important to show that this is not just the United States, it's not just the European Union, this is the entire hemisphere speaking up, speaking out against these undemocratic actions. And so we think it's important for the OAS to continue to play this role. Hope to see more action by the OAS, by the United Nations as well. Our Assistant Secretary met with the Assistant Secretary General from the UN on Monday to talk about the situation in Guatemala and to brainstorm about what actions can be taken in general on Guatemala. I spoke earlier about sanctions and visa restrictions. We continue to carry those out, and I won't go through the laundry list, but visa revocations to really hold these actors accountable in the public sector and the private sector, and we will continue to do so. On November 16th, we announced another round of visa restrictions, and all this to say that we're committed to showing a strong response to undemocratic actions in Guatemala, and have repeatedly said in public that we'll continue to do so. And then, I would also say that when our Assistant Secretary was in Guatemala, his counterpart from the EU also happened to be there, and the European Union had an observation mission in Guatemala for the elections. They've also played an important role and can continue to do so as we look at visa restrictions, as we look at these different categories. that's really top of my mind, and where we are spending a lot of time these days, just given the critical challenges and the frankly extremely long transition period in Guatemala that lasts from the second round of the election on August 20th until January 14th. So we're getting closer, but it's been a long ride, and there's still some time to come, and a lot of desperate anti-democratic actors who will stop at nothing. So this has been an area of real focus for the administration. Just quickly on El Salvador, shifting to El Salvador, we recognize that President Bukele remains widely popular, as does his security policy. Nevertheless, we remain deeply concerned about authoritarian actions and about the state of exception. When it comes to the state of exception, this is something that we have communicated both publicly and privately. We believe must indeed be exceptional. That we recognize the trauma that has come from years of gang violence in El Salvador, and the fact that a lot of individuals feel more secure today. But that doesn't mean that we can't have due process, and that ultimately we want to support the Salvadoran government, the Salvadoran people, in returning to some sort of regular order where there's due process, where the 70,000 individuals who are incarcerated have an ability, many of whom, ultimately might be found guilty, but so those individuals have a right to trials on that. Would also note that a lot of folks have asked about specifics on our policy. I would say we engage privately and publicly with the Salvadoran government and the Salvadoran people on all these issues. We share serious concerns with our Salvadoran partners directly, and reinforce our messaging publicly, and continue to advocate for due process, the rule of law, but also focus on issues that are fundamental in the root cause strategy, including investment in the region, prosperity, because economic prosperity in El Salvador is a win for all of us. And think that there's a dynamic, complex relationship that we continue to look at closely. On Honduras, I would say watching closely. There's a lot of positive action in the U.S.-Honduras relationship, as there is in all these countries, but watching the situation in the Honduran Congress and the Attorney General's office unfold with some concern. This is a situation where an interim Attorney General is appointed after there could not be agreement in Congress and this interim Attorney General is appointed without the requisite 86 votes. And so our hope is that there can be a real return to regular order and a selection of Attorney General in Honduras in the new year. We found, especially in the situation in Guatemala, these Attorneys General positions are so critical. And so it's important that someone be chosen through regular order in Honduras. The Honduran people deserve a qualified, independent Attorney General. And the best way forward here is through dialogue and compromise. And so we'll continue to work with the Honduran people and their government to find a path forward on this and to support efforts at dialogue there. In Nicaragua, the Ortega Murillo regime continues to isolate itself by suppressing democracy, by failing to respect human rights of Nicaraguans, and by deepening its collaboration with authoritarian governments, including Russia. There's a number of troubling issues there. You really don't have much of an opposition to speak of present in the country, just given the fact that individuals who are, demonstrate any sort of dissent are jailed or forced to flee. We continue to call on the immediate release of Bishop Rolando Alvarez and all those who are unjustly detained. I spoke about sanctions. We continue to push for accountability for the Ortega Murillo regime. President Biden issued an executive order in October 2022, a year ago, basically enabling us to take further actions on Nicaragua. And we've done a lot in terms of sanctions, visa revocations, but obviously there's space to do more, just given the continued deteriorating situation in Nicaragua. Let me just close by saying that, I think I pointed out a lot of the challenges in the region, but I'd also say there's a lot of reason for hope, not only because of the results we discussed under our strategies, sort of, not speaking about the statistics, what I cited on, individuals connected to the internet, jobs created, that sort of thing, But more than anything, I think what gives me hope is what we're seeing in Guatemala, for example. We're seeing, I spoke about U.S. policy actions, I spoke about international actions, but ultimately it's the Guatemalan people who have risen up and said, enough is enough, that we're not going to put up with actions by a corrupt attorney general, by actions by corrupt judges and courts to try to undermine an election. So, you see that time and time again, that there's a real will, a democratic spirit in the region. And so, our job is to support that spirit as we look to implement the root cause strategy and help to provide hope and opportunity for the next generation of Central Americans. So with that, Alejandro, I'll shut up and look forward to questions, conversations, comments.
Right. No, thank you very much. I think that was a tour de force through the region. And I think you highlighted the challenges that, Central American countries are facing, how the U.S. government is addressing them. And one question that I have before we turn to the floor is, how are you working with other Latin American governments to try to forge some kind of a broad alliance to support Central American countries? With Colombia or Mexico now. It has become a much more complex environment to work in, no? Or so my question is exactly how are you, besides what you mentioned of the Organization of American States, directly with partner governments, are you working with some of them? Is there a broader coalition of Latin American countries trying to support Central American countries that really want to strengthen the rule of law and economic development and social welfare?
Yeah, it's an important question. And so I'd sort of take two buckets there. I'd say first on the democracy front, there's the Alliance for Development and Democracy, which is a coalition that is composed of Costa Rica, Panama, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, that has really worked together to, try to promote issues like, working together on supply chains, but also on defending democracy. And so they've been really strong in speaking out in Guatemala and speaking out about undemocratic actions to the region. And then more broadly on development, I'd say this is one area where we collaborate closely with Mexico. With U.S. and Mexico are closely synced up when it comes to development in Central America. So, our priorities aren't 100% aligned, but we have a program called Sembrando Oportunidades, where we work together in Honduras on education, on issues with development. This is something that the Mexican government also cares deeply about as we collaborate on migration. So I think there is, especially with Mexico, I think there's a lot of opportunities to deepen that area.
Let's open it up to questions. So I think we have a mic. So let's start with you on the red sweater.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming to speak with us today. My name is Ahmad Ahmed Badami. I'm in the School of Foreign Service. I have a question specifically about China's involvement in Central America, because you've spoken a lot about what the State Department and the U.S. government is doing to help prop up democratic regimes. But at the same time, China's Belt and Road Initiative is sweeping through South America and starting to reach its tentacles into Central America a little bit. Would you be able to comment slightly about what major effects BRI has had in Central America in the past few years, and what, if anything, the State Department is doing to either counter or collaborate with those? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. No, you're absolutely right. It's a great question. And, ultimately, it's a sovereign choice of each and every country in the region to decide whether or not they recognize the PRC or Taiwan. I think our message to countries has always been that you have to look at the history that the PRC has in the region, and sort of, they often sell a false bill of goods. And we see that time and time again. So, for example, that was the message, when Honduras recently flipped recognition from Taiwan to the PRC. And, obviously a sovereign decision. But I think if you look throughout the region, you can find countless examples of broken promises. And it's something that we need to continue to make clear to individuals. But, I think it's not enough to just sort of wave our finger and say, the PRC is not delivering. I think part of it is we have to have a proactive agenda, which is what we do have, which is why, we're doing a lot under the root cause strategy through direct foreign assistance, but also by bringing investment. And that's why the vice president's so focused on bringing investment to the region from U.S. companies, because that really ultimately is what creates jobs and creates good jobs, sustainable jobs, which is, I think, the difference between what we bring and what the PRC brings to the region.
There's a question there. Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jacobstein. I'm Alberto Marisca for the MA Latin America Studies. And well, my question is about Nicaragua, because you just say that in El Salvador, you are helping, you're working with the government in order to make sure that there are ongoing just trials. But then I see that inside in Nicaragua, the position is that the trials are just unjust or there are no trials. So any incarceration about priests or opposition is wrong. Don't you believe that instead the State Department should apply the same weight in its foreign policy towards Nicaragua and towards El Salvador? Because if not, it seems that the ideological differences between the State Department and Nicaragua are the main pillar and not the real path toward justice. Secondly, Nicaragua and the US still share trade interests, the CAFTA-DR. So how then we pose the ideological and democratic question when there are trade interests going on between the US and Nicaragua? Thank you very much.
Thanks for your question. I would say, first of all, we welcome conversations with Nicaragua about the rule of law. I mean, we welcome conversations with them. We've reached out. We have after the release of the 222 unjustly detained individuals, Secretary Blinken spoke with the Nicaraguan foreign minister. So I think we'd welcome a conversation with them about them doing more to get their political prisoners out. I don't think they would be open to those conversations, but certainly would have that. But just to be clear, I mean, this is a consolidated dictatorship where there's no room for dissent. I mean, so I think Nicaragua stands out in the region in a way that others don't. And sure, I mean, there is trade between the countries, but I mean, it raises a good question: to what extent should there be trade with a country that is doing what Nicaragua is doing? And so we have serious concerns, and we voiced those concerns publicly and privately. And the executive order that the president issued in October 2022 authorized us to basically impose additional trade restrictions, and that's a tool that could be used in the future, just given the undemocratic action. So I think, listen, I think there's nuances throughout the region, but I think Nicaragua certainly stands out as a consolidated authoritarian state with zero room for dissent.
Thank you, Alejandro. David Lewis with Manchester Trade, and thanks to Georgetown for bringing Eric, and particularly a good Latin Americanist in the administration, but also a Caribbean expert. So I think that's very important. Going back on the CAFTA-DR question, it's sort of, we've got a situation of good trade, good economics, but bad politics across the region. And we certainly didn't think that would happen 20 years ago, when we thought, hey, you got good trade, good economics, and things are going to improve democratically. You've mentioned a lot of the challenges on that. Could you point to any opportunities the administration is seeing in terms of leveraging the good economics of CAFTA-DR for the political situation?
Yeah, thanks, David. It's an interesting question. I mean, certainly CAFTA-DR, has tons of benefits for the region. And I think there's a lot of ways to leverage those. And I think if you look at Central America Forward, you look at the investments that have been done, I think there's plenty of space for that. And I think there's also plenty of space for additional enforcement in the labor and environmental space on CAFTA-DR. And so when we look at the good jobs, good governance declaration under Central America Forward, it's worth thinking in the context of CAFTA-DR, what more can be done in the labor front, the environmental front. But I certainly think there's a lot of success that has been made in the trade front in Central America. But I think there are questions that are raised when you have a partner like Nicaragua, certainly.
My name is Gabriela. I'm studying a master in global human development. And I want to ask you about migration. Specifically, I have seen studies that says an arc of correlation between the migration from Central America and the effect that they have, like when there is a deportation to Central America in terms of crime rates, when they return due to the lack of opportunities. So I want to know if US, it's, confronting that situation, working with the governments to do something about that.
Thanks for that question. I think one thing that's really important that's being done is USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. They do reintegration work throughout Central America, and particularly in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And a lot of what that is safe reception and return. But I think more is being done at this moment in the reintegration space to ensure that individuals not only return home and get food and sort of a health check and a bus ticket home, but also are able to be reintegrated into communities or able to be set up with opportunities. Because I think you're right. It's important to ensure that returnees have viable opportunities at home. I think for two reasons. One, I think, is sort of the interest of the migrant individual, but I think from a core national security perspective as well, so that you don't see those individuals remigrating. I think that's important as well.
Thank you so much. My name is Veronica. I'm Colombian, and I'm in the SFS program in the Global Human Development as well. My question is about the migration that has been taking place in the Darien Gap in Panama. So currently, the number of migrants crossing the treacherous Darien Gap has surpassed 400,000 people. And even though the United States have put in place like toughest measures to try to deter migrants from crossing, it were down, but now it's increasing again. And you mentioned in the beginning that the United States was trying to put some migration offices in countries like my country, Colombia, to increase or to make more easier the process of asylum seeker. Clearly, this is not working. So I just was wondering what is, if any, there are new strategies from the United States to kind of like solve this issue, because immigration flows are not stopping. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. Yeah, I mean, I think clearly it has to be a combination of enforcement and legal pathways. I would disagree with the notion that the safe mobility offices aren't working. They've just started. So I think, as with all these pathways, they take time, and it takes time to stand them up. And if you look at what's happening to safe mobility offices that are doing expedited refugee processing, I think that my colleagues here from the State Department who's served much longer could speak to this better than I can, but usually refugee processing takes, a couple of years. I mean, this refugee processing is being expedited to take place in a couple of months. So I think things are moving very quickly. It's taken time to stand up. I mean, these were announced in June, and now we're finally getting to see some throughput, to which I think is exciting, because I think A, it shows that the pathway works and it gets individuals through. But B, I think that's a sign to potential migrants that there is a path other than taking the dangerous journey north. So I think, I think legal pathways, there's always a question, but I think we have to continue to look at those and continue to make those work. And then enforcement is key. I mean, the other thing I'd say, which is probably not super popular, but it is that the return flights to Venezuela have had an impact. And the fact that you show that demonstrating that the U.S. will repatriate individuals shows that repatriations occur, and legal pathways can occur if you don't take the dangerous journey north. So I think that combination is what we're looking to do here. Is it perfect? No, but we'll continue to try to get at that right formula to make it work.
Thank you. Matthias Spector with the Americas Institute. I can't help but notice that you didn't mention China in your initial remarks, so I wanted to go back to that. What's so interesting about the lack of China in the remarks is that the contrast with the Trump administration is enormous, right? We heard Trump at the United Nations revive the Monroe Doctrine, but we also heard Mike Pence at the Hudson Institute and Rex Tillerson and Mike Pompeo make lots of references about what they saw, it seems to me, as the threat of China in Central America. My question to you is, would you say that for the current administration, China is not a problem for the region? And as you say, it's a question of countries in the region deciding whether they want to develop closer ties to China or not at their own peril. What's the story there? How should we describe the way the administration sees China in that part of the world?
Yeah, thank you. No, I mean, I wouldn't say that it was an an omission to speak to priorities. This was a talk about U.S. policy in Central America, not about sort of our broader policy toward the region. But I would say certainly, I mean, certainly concerns about the PRC in the region. But do we counter that by yelling and screaming all the time about it, or do we counter it by having a positive, proactive agenda? I would argue a positive, proactive agenda is the way forward to the extent that we're able to do so.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gabriel. I was born in Colombia as well, and I am also a U.S. Army veteran. So my question is the next, and to put in some context, the U.S. sanctions on Venezuela have worked, I guess, throughout the years, to the point that have brought Venezuelan people to a very precarious situation, and we have a massive influx of Venezuelans to Colombia and to the rest of the region, to the United States. It has become somehow an issue. So right now there is a great chance for the Venezuelan people to change their regime, right? And it's kind of where the point of all these sanctions have finally worked. So we might have some type of change. Might not be the best option, but there will be some change indeed. And some preoccupation of these elections are going to be how fair are they going to be, and if the international community is going to be watching them, so the Venezuelan people can actually choose their president. So what is this administration thinking on the Venezuelan elections? Of course, we're not going to try to intervene or anything like that, but since the United States was the one that imposed all of these sanctions, right? And it's been a working process for so many years. Now is the point that might be a change, and that's going to also stop migration, illegal immigration. So that's just my question. What is the way forward for Venezuelan elections?
My get out of jail free card on this is that I don't handle Venezuela. Or I was going to defer to Jimmy's story, but no, but we will, important questions and obviously a critical moment, and we're really focused on free and fair elections, but we're happy to follow up and get the right people on our team here, because I think it would be important for folks to talk to you about Venezuela and our approach, because there's a lot of people working hard on a really challenging, nuanced issue. So happy to have follow up with you to get the right people here.
Thanks very much. Quick shout out for your discipline in staying within the portfolio. Well done. Secondly, and seriously, a serious shout out for your personal diplomacy on Guatemala. I have not seen an administration be as active on a particular bilateral case of democracy in peril in a while. And I know you've had a good bit to do there. My question has to do with sanctions in Guatemala and the use of sanction policy. Do you think there's a chance that the sanctions against those who would take undemocratic activities, those who have been, supping off the government trowel for a long time, that the sanctions are already kind of built in? And I'm wondering if talking to people in Guatemala, if we're going to eventually sort of hit the end of the road with sanctions. And keeping in mind that once you put a sanction on, like taking away a visa, we all know that, we always say you're free to reapply in the future, but very few of those ever get given. And so the threat of sanctions, very useful. But are we perhaps deluding ourselves into thinking that that's going to get, for example, the Attorney General or some of her closest collaborators who have already been sanctioned, that we're going to scare away the others? Or is that already baked in if people feel that their calculus of needs, they understand they're never going to Disneyland again?
No, thanks, John. It's a terrific question. I think it's a challenging one to answer. I mean, I think part of it is we work with the tool set we have, and this is what we have to make changes. But I think you're right. I mean, I think with certain individuals, you're not going to get them to change behavior. But I think with others, I think there's opportunities, and I think especially some of those visa sanctions that have not been made public. Some are made public, some are not. So I think there's individuals where there's conversations being had, and individuals who would like to regain visas. And I think it also speaks to the need for other countries to impose sanctions. So that's not just the United States. Would it matter as much random country X in Latin America imposing sanctions? No, but some of the other countries that individuals from Guatemala who are sanctioned in the U.S. might travel to, that might make a difference. So I think that's why some of the multilateral actions important, and if other countries could take similar actions, I think could have a big impact.
Hey, thank you for being here with us. Earlier, you spoke about collaborating a bit with the private sector in Guatemala to stop state actors from undermining democracy. And to put a little bit of context into my question, I'm currently working on a project with Cargill, who's a signatory to the PCA, on working with the U.S. government as well as governments in Central America on shared development goals, specifically through agriculture. So I'm curious as to your opinion on how the U.S. government can, successfully engage with and collaborate the private sector on issues such as economic development, where their goals are clearly well aligned.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and that's something that we're really focused on, and this has been a huge focus. I mentioned I worked for Vice President Harris, or Alejandra did, and she spent a lot of time and effort in finding ways to work with the private sector to put in place public-private partnerships on these issues that we care deeply about. And I think part of it is a recognition that you have the root cause strategy, you have foreign assistance, but there's just so much more that you can leverage through private companies and through companies that are committed to good jobs, good governance. So I think there's a myriad of opportunities. The Partnerships for Central America has really done outstanding work in pushing for companies to invest in the region. And sometimes it's hard to measure exactly what's new investment versus what's expected investment already. But I really do think we've generated a good amount of new investment that really wouldn't be there without the efforts of the Vice President, without the efforts of the Partnership for Central America. So I think there's really a ton of opportunities to partner, whether it's on connectivity, digital access, or just the anti-corruption and governance agenda. Really a ton of space there.
Hi, how are you? Winelli, MA Latin American Studies. My question is, to what extent does CEN communicate with the Nicaraguan opposition? And with that said, do you see any fruitful conversations coming from this, since obviously not a lot can be done from inside the country? Thank you.
See you again. Yes, absolutely. So when I was in Costa Rica in September, we met with Nicaraguan opposition leaders. I mean, unfortunately, a lot, the vast majority, all of Nicaraguan's opposition leaders are abroad and not in the country, just because dissent has been completely outlawed and individuals been imprisoned, and it's a really terrible situation. So yes, we're in constant contact with individuals from the Nicaraguan opposition, with the Monteverde group, and supporting them through U.S. government funding, but also finding ways to bolster their messaging and continue to make clear what's going on, because I think in essence, sometimes it can be one of these democracy dies in darkness sort of thing. And it's really important to continue to shine light on what's happening in Nicaragua, because, it doesn't necessarily make the headlines every day, but doesn't mean the situation there is getting any easier.
Hi there. I'm Sarah. I'm a Georgetown alum, but currently work for McLarty Associates. I just wanted to raise a question on Panama, which I don't think we've touched on at all yet. The country has really been in a lot of turmoil in recent weeks with massive protests over the copper mining contract, which was recently declared unconstitutional. Just wanted to ask what the U.S. government is kind of thinking about in terms of that, in terms of risks for the private sector, but also just generally managing the blockades and other economic impacts in Panama right now from that unrest.
Thanks for the question. It has been a troubling situation, and glad to see that the protests have died down this week. I mean, from our perspective, respect for investment's critical, but respect for the rule of law is also important. And so the Supreme Court made its decision, and we'll continue to talk to all actors across the political spectrum to ensure calm there, but also ensure that investors are able to have stability for their investments. Obviously, the mining sector is a very important sector in Panama, and something that we're keeping a close eye on.
Great, thank you. I'm coming from the MS in Global Health program. Jumping back to El Salvador really quick, you mentioned that now that there's a greater feeling of sense of security within the population. What is the U.S. government strategy to create a sense of urgency within the population for a return to due process?
Thanks. It's an interesting question. I mean, you look at the state of exception in El Salvador. I mean, I think, it's extremely popular, right? It's like, something like, I don't want to say the poll numbers, but it's, 80-90% popularity. I think my sense from visiting, and sometimes when you visit, you pop in quickly. You don't get the full nuance that people get from living there every day. But I do think, for many people, there's a greater sense of security. But we do think there needs to be a return to regular order on due process. So, we do this through, conversations, collaboration with the government. I mean, my feeling on this is that the best way to do this is by having those conversations, working together, seeing if there's a way that the state of exception can indeed be exceptional and that we can find a way back to due process. So this is something that we continue to have close conversations with civil society, with NGOs, but also with the government itself. I met with the Minister of Security in El Salvador when I visited in September, and it's a conversation we'll continue to have to see how to find a way to increase security, but also ensure that due process and rights are respected.
I mean, a follow-up on that, are there, creative ideas on how to create a transition towards back to normality, but that you have at least some kind of intermediate justice that can address the stock of cases in a relatively sensible horizon? Or, what are the ideas that are being assessed to do some kind of transition back to the normal rule of law?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, and it's probably a question for people smarter than me on these citizen security issues. But I would say ultimately this is something that the Salvadoran government will have to do, and we want to offer support because it's something we believe in. We believe that due process is important, but ultimately this is something that the Salvadoran government will have to do. But we have really impressive group of folks at USAID, at the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Bureau, at the State Department, who have worked on these citizen security issues for years. So I think there's opportunities for collaboration there down the road.
Great. Let's see if there's any final question. Let's go back.
Thank you. One final question, deviating slightly south from the Central America region. Over the past couple of days, Venezuela and Brazil have been increasing their military activity around the Guianan border after the recent discovery and giving to Exxon of offshore oil fields. And the Venezuelan government has a referendum coming up in a few days to, if I remember correctly, decide on whether or not to invade the disputed waters and disputed territory that they share with Guyana. I understand that Venezuela is not your area of expertise, but just in general, would you be able to comment on what options the State Department has to deal with this possibility, one, before the referendum comes out, and two, assuming that the referendum is approved and Venezuela does take military action, what can the State Department do? Thank you.
I hate to do this, but I'm gonna pull my "don't handle Venezuela" card on this. But I appreciate the question; it's a good one. I said, was there another hand? Oh.
Okay. Okay, so we will invite, the rest of the Latin American continent at the State Department to have a discussion on Venezuela, Guyana, Brazil, Argentina, and other countries. But today we want to thank Eric for coming back to Georgetown, for being so open and candid with us on the work that he and the State Department has been doing in Central America. And we wish you, the best in what lies ahead. And we hope to have you back to continue monitoring what's going on in the region and how the U.S. policy is evolving in its engagement with the Central American countries. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Alejandro. Thank you all. Thanks all of you. Appreciate it. Thank you.